Hi, ladies. I just wanted to finish talking about these powers of the president with you. And the fifth one, executive privilege, is kind of a complicated one. And it's one of those ones that not everyone even agrees that it exists. The courts have sort of acknowledged that it does, but Congress never has. But executive privilege is basically the idea that maybe the president doesn't have to uh, disclose every bit of information that he has or every conversation that he's had to the courts, because in a way that protects his ability to be completely honest with his staff and the ability of his staff to be completely honest with him on important things. And maybe if they thought that things would be reported, they wouldn't necessarily be able to be totally honest with each other, and that would hinder their ability to do their jobs. Now, the most famous instance in which this came up is, and you see my picture of Richard Nixon there, is the United States versus Nixon. After the Watergate scandal, uh, the courts were investigating this. We're trying to find out what Nixon might be guilty of. And here's the thing: President Nixon, in the Oval Office, his office when he was president, had actually recorded all of his conversations. And the courts obviously wanted access to these. And Nixon, knowing that he sort of admitted to being someone involved with the Watergate scandal on there, didn't want to disclose them, so he tried to claim executive privilege, that he as the president didn't have to disclose these things. What the courts ruled in this particular case, though, was that they agreed with him in the sense that executive privilege does exist, but they said in this particular instance it has nothing to do with actually doing your job, and it's more about investigating a criminal matter. So they said executive privilege does exist, but it doesn't necessarily apply in this particular situation. But to state it one more time, it's the idea that the president doesn't have to disclose certain information to the Congress or the courts as a matter of privilege and protecting information as the chief executive of the country. Now, on this one, chief diplomat, you'll notice that word diplomat, same root word as diplomacy again, and to reiterate from the roles that we talked about in chapter 13, this is always going to refer to the president dealing with our relationship with other countries. Okay, that's what this is about. There's several ways in which you can do that. We're going to highlight a couple of them here. You've probably heard of treaties in your history classes. These are situations in which you're going to sign major agreements with other countries, and the president can certainly do that, although they have to be approved by the Senate, as many of the actions of the president do. In the picture there, you actually see President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and he's on the right. And on the left, that is the last leader of the Soviet Union, when it still existed, that is Mikhail Gorbachev. And he, the two of them together signed an agreement to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that each country had. So that's an example of a treaty. Sometimes presidents will also sign executive agreements with other countries. These do not need to be approved by Congress, either because they're sort of an extension of some existing legislation, existing laws, or simply they don't have the same level of strength as a treaty and then sort of can disappear with the changing of one president to another. Finally, the one at the bottom there is maybe the strangest of all of these, the recognition power. And the idea behind the recognition power is that the president, as the person who's developing our foreign policy, can literally acknowledge whether another country officially exists or not. Look at their government and acknowledge, okay, you are the legitimate government of this country or you're not. For years, the United States looked at the communist Chinese government and didn't acknowledge that it was the rightful government of China. We do now, but up until I think it was the 1970s, we did not. And of course, once that happens, we can then have a diplomatic exchange of ambassadors and have a relationship with that country. But there are certain countries in the world at various times where the United States may not necessarily even acknowledge their government to be the rightful government of that country. The president's powers as commander-in-chief are pretty straightforward. Again, he's the head of all branches of the United States military. Now, we know that officially only Congress can declare a war. However, we also know that the president can basically start an undeclared war because he has the power to send troops and direct them into certain areas. That's what happened in Korea, the Korean War. That's what happened in the Vietnam War. And even more recently, it's also what has happened with the conflicts that you remember in Afghanistan and Iraq. The last thing to mention here, Congress can authorize joint resolutions giving him the power to act in certain situations, even if they're not declaring war. And also, the War Powers Resolution of 1973 tried to put some limits on what the president can do with the military to limit his ability to start a war without the consent of Congress. However, this War Powers Resolution of 1973 has, for the most part, been ignored, and many look at it as potentially even being unconstitutional. So in reality, it hasn't had much of an effect on anything, really. Remember one more time that anytime you see that word legislative, we're talking about lawmaking, and we know that the president has a role to play in the process of making laws. One of these is sort of unofficial. We call it the message power, the fact that the president can urge Congress to pass certain pieces of legislation. For example, President Obama, with his health care bill, said to Congress, I would really like you to update the healthcare system in this country and pass this law. And in that case, at that time with the Democratic Congress, they were able to get that done. So that's what we'd call the message power, the fact that he can urge Congress to pass certain pieces of legislation. But we also know that if Congress does pass laws, or I should call them bills because they're not laws yet, if Congress does pass a bill, the president can sign it into law, and he can also veto it. We talked about all of that last unit. Now, the key is the president can either sign the whole bill or he can veto the whole bill. He can't pick and choose parts of it. If he could, we would call that a line item veto, where he can just strike out certain parts of the law but keep the rest of it. Many presidents have said they'd like to have this option. However, what the Supreme Courts have ruled is that the Constitution doesn't allow for that. It says he can veto it or he can sign it. It doesn't allow for anything in between. So if you wanted the president to have the option of a line item veto, you would have to amend the Constitution in order to give him that power. The last thing we'll mention on the legislative powers is that the president can call a special session of Congress. We know that sometimes Congress is in session, but sometimes they adjourn and the members will often go back to their home states or travel around. But if there's an emergency situation that needs to be dealt with and Congress is not in session, the president does have the authority to call them back into session, even if it's not a scheduled time that they would normally be in session. All right, finally, we've got the president's judicial powers. Judicial, the word there being judge, we're referring to the courts. And obviously the job of the judicial branch is to interpret the laws, but the president has some roles he can play involved in the courts. Now, one thing I need to make clear here before we talk about any of these is the president's power relating to the courts is only about the federal courts. The national court system that deals with the laws made by Congress for the whole country. The president has no power over the state laws. We make our own state laws in Frankfurt as well. Our General Assembly passes them, the governor signs them into law, but the president has no power related to those. That's a state thing. We're only talking about the national, the federal laws here. A couple of these powers. He can grant reprieves. That's postponing a sentence being carried out. It could be a death sentence, but honestly, those don't happen very often at the federal level. So it's just delaying the start of whatever someone has been sentenced to for a particular crime. Or the president can actually grant a pardon, meaning complete forgiveness of the crime, just wipes it out. Presidents will often do that actually in the last couple of weeks of their terms if there's been some pardons they want to grant. Because they're not always super popular, so if the president is about to leave office, he may grant a few last-minute pardons. Most famously, maybe not most famously, but President Clinton pardoned his own brother for some drug charges, his half-brother, Roger Clinton, before he left office. That was probably in January of 2001, I suppose that would be. And also, after the Watergate scandal, Nixon could have faced some prison time, but President Ford, his vice president who succeeded him, granted him a pardon, saying that he didn't want to drag the nation through the trouble of witnessing this trial and drag out the pain of the country. So he just went ahead and pardoned President Nixon for the Watergate scandal. Looking at the two at the bottom, the president can also commute a sentence. He could shorten it. If you were sentenced to life, he could shorten it to 25 years or give you the possibility of parole or something along those lines. And finally, sometimes presidents will issue an amnesty, a blanket pardon. maybe people have not been up to date paying on their taxes, and you might say anybody who gets up to date by this deadline will not face any penalty for their late taxes in the past, or something of that nature. So a forgiveness, a pardon offered to a large group of people all at one time. That would be a good definition for amnesty. All right, I hope this was helpful for you guys to finish out this section. Let me know if you have any more questions, and I look forward to seeing you in class.